Hello and welcome to Kickback Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Luke. This podcast is your place to get the tools and knowledge necessary to navigate the world of health and wellness. So kick back and let's talk science. This is good content. This stuff has gone great. We'll jump into it. Let's dive in. Let's do a little science. I'm going nitty gritty science right now.
I've been looking forward to this.
Kind of going on a little bit of a tangent.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for tuning in to another Kickback Science podcast.
Running it back.
We're missing Joe again. So
Luke and I.
You'll have to just get by listening to us talk, having a normal conversation without any interruptions to talk about people lifting things up with their teeth.
Or Justin Jefferson poops.
So it's just me and Reed again.
Forgot about that.
Talk about the weather. We should have like pre-recording Joe comments.
Yeah.
That we can just push the button. Have him upload them. Did you know? All right, so today's episode, we're going to cover the fat-burning zones of exercise. Well, really, like the fat-burning zone. Now, so many trainers, I see all these videos posted online of like, oh, you want to exercise at this intensity. This is where you're going to burn the most fat. And you see people like kind of pushing this idea of like, oh, if you exercise too hard, you're not going to burn fat. And so all these like training programs are like optimal program for fat burning. And so it's this fat burning zone. And then the reason we decided to do this podcast is because Reed, when you were a personal trainer,
that's all we did.
Yeah.
Everything. It was just molded around the fat burning zone. Getting people to eat healthier, change the way they burn fats and what zones they need to spend time in. So that was basically everything. So don't crush my heart.
I won't break your heart.
Okay,
well,
thank you.
I'm going to break your heart. I'm going to break your heart. Because I think the fat burning zone is such a joke. It's like...
I drank the Kool-Aid.
It's all right. It's all right. So, fat burning zone. You may have heard people talk about these different like zones of exercise. Typically, they're broken up into 5 different zones, and it can be based off of heart rate, RPE, or rating of perceived exertion, or VO2 max. And there's not like a perfect number for each of these zones, but essentially they're a percentage of either your max heart rate or VO2 max. And they're split into zone 1 through 5. So zone 1 is like your active recovery, like you're not really working. Zone 2 we've talked about in other podcasts where you're approaching this maximum, what we call aerobic capacity or utilizing oxygen, where you can tolerate that exercise for a very long amount of time. Like you're not going to fatigue, but it's still exercise, right? And
so would that be something you'd run a marathon in, zone 2, you think? Or do you think they're running more zone 3?
You're going to be in zone 2. I mean, you'll tap into to zone 3 when you have to like do that final bout.
Yeah.
But marathon being like such long distance, they're going to be running at this threshold. So like the lactate threshold where you're still able to sustain that output for a long time without fatiguing. And there's some like crazy science in the ability to like find this exact speed, this exact heart rate, this exact lactate level for each individual athlete to like come up with like, okay, what speed should they be at to be at this level? And they can run that speed and know that they're not going to fatigue. And then you can actually like calculate out once somebody goes to an increase in speed or an increase in heart rate, how long do they have before they fatigue? And so you can plan out these exact bursts at the end of the race, knowing like, okay, once I hit this point, I can run this speed and I'll be at this heart rate and this lactate. And I know right when I get to the finish line, I'll be gassed. Yeah. But I don't want to be gassed beforehand. And that's a topic for another.
Kind of like the Olympics the other day. That girl from the Netherlands just like kicked it into high gear at the end.
Right.
And it was like, we were way ahead. Yeah. But then she just had this like extra burst. Like she was in the middle of the pack and then she just Kind of like you see in horses too. They just save that zone 3 and just like.
Well, it's like that's like
zone
zone
4.
5. For
Yeah,
them
zone
at that
5.
point.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, if they were earlier on in the race, if they were running too hard, they wouldn't have that like nitrous boost in the tank. So you got to save it. But okay, we're going on a tangent.
Yeah,
see, look at you. Now you're like doing the tangents with me.
Joe's gone. I have to do it.
It's hard enough when it's just me going on the tangents, and now you're coming with me. So zones. Zone 1 being the easiest, zone 5 being the hardest. Zone 5 is, you'll see on these like heart rate trackers, like 90 to 100% of your heart rate max. And another side tangent, the heart rate max trackers are so dumb because they just go off of like what your age is. There's this popular equation to estimate heart rate max. It's 220 minus age. And then it's like taking a percentage of that and putting you in these zones. And I get why gyms hang them up because you don't have the time to like go to each individual member and test their resting heart rate.
Yeah.
But to put this into perspective, let's say, you take a 60-year-old individual and therefore their heart rate max is 160. And is that math right? Yeah, that's right. So their heart rate max is 160 and you want to get them at a certain percentage of heart rate max, but their resting heart rate is like 95. And then you take another 60-year-old individual whose resting heart rate, like they could be a marathon runner, their resting heart rate's like 50. And you're just going off of heart rate max when you put these percentages in. And so it's like, target heart rate of 120. Now think of how much more work the person with a resting heart rate of 55 or 50 has to do versus somebody with a resting heart rate of 95.
Yeah.
It looks totally different. So that's why these like heart rate percentage charts that you see at the gym, like
I always saw it at our gym too, because we had an app where you could like hook up somebody to just test out heart rate.
Yeah.
And they'd be doing a zone 1, zone 2, and they're in zone 4, zone 5. It was like, ooh, you should probably get tested. But like these are way off.
Yeah.
Compared to their RPE.
So So like what you really want to do is you want to go off of percentage of what's called heart rate reserve, where it's resting, or it's your max heart rate minus your resting heart rate. That's the reserve capacity that each individual has to train at. And it's going to be different for everyone. But back from this tangent, back to the zones. So the zone training, like zone 1 being easiest, zone 2 being a little bit harder, zone 3, that's when you're getting into the more higher intensity exercise, stuff that you can't sustain long term. And then the harder you push yourself, you get into zone 4 versus zone 5, which is like, max all out effort there.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea where if you're in zone 2, you're going to lose more body fat than if you were to work out in those higher zones. That's what this fat burning zone is, and that's what the premise is. Now, and where it came from is if I had you go exercise on a treadmill while hooked up to a metabolic cart. In a metabolic cart, we can measure the amount of oxygen you're taking in and the amount of CO2 you're exhaling. And by measuring those things, I can see what fuels you're using during that exercise, and I can get an idea of how difficult it is for you. So you'll measure what's called the VCO2, the volume of CO2 to the volume of oxygen that you exhale. And that's called your respiratory exchange ratio. And you probably saw this when you do these metabolic tests. You see this number, and you can tell is someone burning, mostly fats, which tends to be right at this
1 and
0.7 ratio. And then carbohydrates, you start to see CO2 increase, the production of CO2. And you see that number, that ratio approach 1. And once that ratio is at 1, then somebody's burning more carbohydrates and less fat.
Yeah.
And so knowing that information, I don't know who the heck decided we measured that when somebody's at these lighter intensities, they're burning less carbohydrates and they're burning way more fat as like a proportion. So we should exercise at these lower intensities because then you're burning more fat. Because once you increase intensity, we see carbohydrates being utilized. We don't want to utilize carbs. We just want fat, right?
Yeah.
And so people came from or developed this idea of the fat burning zones from that premise of being able to actually measure, are you burning carbohydrates or are you burning fat? Now, to make more sense of that, let's just kind of review how your body utilizes fuel during exercise. All right, saddle up. Saddle up, partner. Still want to go to Aspen?
Big gulps, huh?
Well, see you later. Oh, man, Dumb and Dumber, classic. So, we should start thinking of Dumb and Dumber analogies. We'll come up with
Yeah.
But, okay, fuel utilization. Here we go. Joe, I need you to pull me back from my tangents so you can go on your tangents and have crazy ADD. So, when you are sitting here, like you and I just sitting here at rest, our body is maximizing its ability to utilize fat. And the reason is fat gives us so much freaking energy. So we've talked about ATP in this podcast, or the currency of the cell. You want to try to make ATP, which is, it's an adenosine molecule that has 3 phosphate groups. When you break apart those phosphate groups, you go from adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, to adenosine diphosphate, and that releases a shit ton of energy that your body can use. And so we love ATP, and we break it apart to utilize energy. And so the body has come up with these really, really complex systems to break down different, what we call substrates, where I'm talking about carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And your body can break down those substrates and produce ATP that we can then utilize for energy. And it turns out that fat has so much energy to give. And so our body loves it because we get so much more ATP out of it. Like, you get like hundreds of ATP off of one fatty acid. And that doesn't mean anything. Me saying 100, like, I got to tell you what you get from burning glucose.
That sounds
like, wow, triple digits,
whoa,
man. That's crazy.
So, Benjamin, whoa.
Yeah. I like your lack of reactions, like, it's cool.
Yeah, that'd be like 1 million. 100. Cool.
Yeah. I suppose I should probably tell you how you
throw a bigger number out there next time.
So, to put some context, like, your body can use what's called the phosphagen system, where creatine phosphate, it's creatine with a phosphate, that molecule will just donate its phosphate group to adenosine diphosphate. So the adenosine molecule that only has 2 phosphates. Remember, we want to have a 3rd phosphate to make ATP. So creatine phosphate's like, oh, yo, I got a phosphate right here. Like, homie. You want one of these? I got you, homie. And so it'll toss its phosphate over to ADP and then make ATP. Boom, you've got energy just like that. Creatine's just like sitting there waiting, like, oh, yo, here's my phosphate. And you get 1 ATP from that. So 1 relative to hundreds from a fatty acid molecule. And then glucose, when you break down glucose or carbohydrates in the cell, so when you take in carbohydrates, it gets stored as glucose, unless you have excess, and it gets stored as fat. But inside of the muscle and inside of other cells, you can store glucose as glycogen, or you can take in glucose from the blood and you can break it down. Now, you only get a couple ATP from a process of breaking down glucose if you're not letting that glucose go into the mitochondria and going through what's called the mitochondria, good old powerhouse of the cell. So glucose can get broken down into what's called pyruvate. And there's a variety of steps where you're essentially, like, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, and you're splitting these carbons into 2 3-carbon molecules, and you're breaking them down until you get to a 2-carbon molecule, and then it's got the decision, that molecule has a decision to enter into the mitochondria as pyruvate, get converted into what's called acetyl-CoA. I don't need to go into all the biochemistry. I'm sorry.
You're throwing me back to human phys.
Yeah. Dude. So pyruvate's kind of at this crossroads where it's like the decision maker of, okay, should I go into the mitochondria and get broken down and produce just a shit ton of energy, or do we need energy right now? And that crossroads is really important. So when we're sitting here at rest, pyruvate will decide to go into the mitochondria, go through the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle or oxidative phosphorylation. They're all referring to the same thing when you hear those things. And it's your mitochondria's ability to take these molecules and just produce way more energy, between like 32 to 38 ATP with 1 round of one of those acetyl-CoAs. And, well, I shouldn't say 1. I won't go too much into the weeds, but essentially when you break down glucose, you get a couple acetyl-CoAs
Yeah.
and they go through around like one glucose will give you 32 to 38. But that's neither here nor there. And that process takes time though. It takes a little time for your mitochondria to break down fuel and to produce ATP. So if you're in the need for energy right now, like you're running from a bear, that pyruvate,
The fight or flight response, yeah.
Yeah, you're in that fight or flight response. That pyruvate is not going to go into the mitochondria. It's not going to get converted into acetyl-CoA. What's going to happen is it's just going to pop right to lactate. And that happens outside of the mitochondria, and it's very fast. Now, the process of going glucose, pyruvate, and lactate, that's what we call anaerobic glycolysis. Now, aerobic is referring to oxygen. Anaerobic is referring to without oxygen, so without the need of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Oxygen is needed for the process that happens in the mitochondria. And so when we talk about aerobic, we're talking about what happens in the mitochondria. Anaerobic is outside of the mitochondria. So glucose to pyruvate to lactate, that's anaerobic, and that produces just a couple ATP. But that process has to happen in order for that cycle to continue. And that's when you need that really fast-acting energy. Now, fatty acids, they're always getting brought into the mitochondria and getting converted into acetyl-CoA, going through that Krebs cycle, and they go through a bunch of times because they got way more carbon than glucose. It really comes down to how much carbon do you have to give to go through this process in the mitochondria. And then those fatty acid molecules get hundreds of ATP, and which read 100 is a lot. Okay. Okay. All right. Relative to creatine phosphate, like 1 ATP, like what a loser. You can only donate 1. Cool. Like fatty acids are like, yo, you want some energy?
You want a bag?
I got you. And so fatty acids, they'll go through that process, but it takes time. But your body loves it because it's like, whoa, a lot of bang for your buck, right?
Yeah.
So when we're sitting here, our mitochondria are really active. That aerobic metabolism is really high. And so we're using mostly fats because we get the most ATP from them. It's very easy for your body to go through that process. It just takes time. So then when we're referring to like exercise, when you're breaking down all these fuels and going through oxidative phosphorylation, you're in burning fats, you're not producing as much CO2 as a byproduct here. And so when I measure, so if I put a metabolic mask on you, which for the listeners that don't know, you may have seen or done this yourself where you've been hooked up to a mask that covers your nose and can measure the amount of oxygen and CO2 you're breathing in and exhaling. And it does that by measuring room air, how much oxygen do you have in the room, and how much CO2 do you have in the room, and then just calculates the difference when you exhale. So, how much oxygen have you utilized in that breath and how much CO2 have you produced? And what happens when we're burning fat is we don't make a lot of CO2, and so that ratio of CO2 to O2 is lower, and that's burning fat. And I feel like I'm coming back to the same thing here. So you just gotta pull me out of this freaking tangent. I'll just keep going.
I think we're still on zone 3.
No, I'm explaining how we use fuels, okay? And then, so as you ramp up exercise, that's when you start to like, whoa, I need energy right now. And so I'm going to shift to utilizing more carbohydrates here. But then that's where people are like, oh, well, we don't want to use carbohydrates. We want to burn fat, right? Everyone's talking about like fat loss.
Zone 1, zone 2 only. Let's go.
Yeah. And so, that's what I'm here today to convince you that like it's not that freaking simple. Like that's not actually what happens.
Dang.
But I don't have to go into those tangents quite yet. So that's does that make sense? Like that's the idea of fat burning zone is like, oh, the lighter intensities relative to carbohydrates, you burn more fat. And it's just because your body loves doing that. If you wanted to be in a zone where you burn the most fat relative to carbohydrates, go to sleep. Like that's you're really burning fat.
Hit the gym hard and then just go to sleep.
Yeah, relative to carbohydrates, you're burning way more fat.
So like when did like fat burning zones like begin? Do you know the history on it? Because like when I started, it was kind of new, the RMA, the resting metabolic assessment, and the AMA, which is with the mask, running on a treadmill. How long has this been going on? Like I've only known since 2015, but I'm sure it's been before that. My dad has done the test before. Has this always been kind of a thing? Because you don't hear about it back in like the 50s. No one did like active metabolic assessments back in the day there.
Yeah, like historically, once we, it was back like, I think it was in like the 20s where there's these things called like Douglas bag assessments that they discovered this ability to measure oxygen and CO2. It's kind of wild how they used to do it.
Back in the 20s, okay.
Yeah, and I think the guy's name was like A.V. Hill or something. I didn't recently look into this, but I'm trying to think back to like XFIS and all that. But it's been a long time that we've had the ability to measure these things. And then having a good understanding of like how the body utilizes substrates, which again, when I say substrates, I'm talking about carbohydrates, fat, and protein, and knowing how it changes with exercise. I mean, we've known that over the course of the last 100 years or so. Like obviously not all of it, our knowledge has been evolving. But I think once like exercise and gyms and personal training and all that stuff started to grow, like people started being less active at work and less manual labor and requiring more like structured exercise. Like you look back in history and like there weren't like group fit classes before work because people were active, walking everywhere and like didn't need that. Now we need it. And so now there's this like business of activity, right? Like trying to promote activity, and you worked in
optimizing time and optimizing your workouts.
Yeah. And the biggest selling point to get someone to buy your product, to buy your advice, to be a client of yours as a trainer, as a gym, as any business promoting activity, the biggest selling point you can provide is this will help you lose weight or burn fat. Like that's all people seem to care about now. And so I don't know like the exact date of when it started, but I think once things started to turn more like people are promoting their businesses and trying to get clientele, like I think that's when it's really caught on. Yeah, it's just like it's a selling point, but it's a false selling point. Like it is not true, and I think it's easy to convince people that it is, but it's not.
Dang, that kind of hurts because that's like all we built our training around is like heart rate training. Fat burn zones, 80% in the zone 1, zone 2, 20% in the zone 3, 4, 5.
And like what were the big things, like what were your selling points of like why these things work for people, and like
basically what you stated, just you're burning more fat in zone 1, zone 2. We're just going to optimize your training to see how many calories you're burning, and then zone 3, 4, and 5, use those to burn more calories. But you don't want to do it too much because then that could stress your body out, put too much stress on your body. You hold inflammation. You're not losing weight. That's basically what we did. So we didn't do too much like HIIT training. We did it once in a while, like maybe once a week, some HIIT training. But other than that, it was zone 1, zone 2.
Yeah. That's another thing I heard too, is like people making this claim of, oh, if you're stressed out, and there's been this like old claim that like you don't want to exercise to increase cortisol levels. Like once cortisol increases, that's your body's stress hormone, and it's not healthy for you and all this shit. And it's like, that's so not true. Now,
that's all
we've been talking so much about how exercise is an acute response, meaning it's an immediate response that your body has, or an acute stress response versus a chronic stress response. So chronic being long-term. Now, when you have an acute response to anything or an acute stress response, that's a good thing. That's a signal to your body like, whoa, let's take care of that. And it'll do that. It'll adapt to make sure that next time that stressor happens, it won't be as harmful to your body, versus chronic inflammation or chronic stress. Your body doesn't have the recovery period to adapt. So there's no time for it to adapt. And so that's when you run into these issues. And again, it's people picking at these like physiology or like mechanistic ideas of like cortisol's bad in certain instances.
Yeah.
Therefore, cortisol's always bad. Or fat burning happens at this zone. Therefore, no fat burning happens at other zones.
Yeah.
It's like these like absolute like hyperbolic claims that people make, and it's attractive to a listener who doesn't have the knowledge, thinking like, oh shit, that makes sense. Like, I don't want cortisol. That's not good for my body.
That's not
like,
good for me. No.
I'm not gonna do high intensity, or like, I'm not gonna do I want to burn fat. So I'm going to just walk instead of train. Now, I haven't really explained like why this shit is false, right?
Yeah.
But like, so are you done explaining like what you did at Lifetime before I get into like...
I mean, we did more. We did like a resting metabolic assessment where they just sat there, laid for like 30 minutes, and we just kind of read what they breathed during rest or sleep. Like people that had poor diets were burning a lot of carbs while they were just resting, and we had to tailor their nutrition plan to help burn more fat while they're resting in that zone 1. So that one, I thought that was very important. Hopefully that's not a whole bunch of baloney, because I pitched a lot. Not many people did it, but people that wanted to hone in their nutrition and what they were burning at rest, that was a really important one. But yeah, active metabolic assessment, we just did 1 through 5. Zone 4 and 5 didn't show any fat burn. And you're saying you're still burning fat when you're in that like fight or flight zone in like 5, you're still burning fat? Because we said it's like throwing gas in the fire. You're using all the gas, those carbs that you have, and that's what you're burning there if you're trying to burn more calories. But if you're trying to burn more fats, 1 through 3, mostly 1 and 2, but you're still burning a little bit in 3. But that's really kind of what we were taught the whole time, and that's kind of our selling point to everyone. I mean, I saw it work for people, but that's probably just because they're being active.
Right?
Yeah, they're exercising.
Yeah.
And it was getting progressively easier because we'd usually have them test every 3 months. We'd get their VO2 max. And if you don't know what VO2 max is, give that podcast a listen. It's really, really good. Yeah, that's an awesome one. So we could see people increasing their VO2 max. If they're not, we're going to hit a little bit more 3, 4, 5. That's going to increase that VO2 max more. So there were good points to it. But now you're kind of telling me that this whole fat burn zone's kind of baloney.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that people were doing well on it because they're exercising.
Yeah.
And I think it all comes back to adherence, right? Like as a like large corporation like Lifetime or other gyms, like you're thinking, okay, how can I get the most clients at the gym? And based on the data, less people enjoy high intensity exercise versus low intensity.
That's very
so if
true.
I tell people, lower intensities, more healthy, then you're going to have the like, whoa, I'm way more healthier than if I was doing high intensity. Like I'm going to come here and do this. And like, you're going to get a higher adherence, and people are going to improve over time because they're active, they're motivated to do that. And so that like makes perfect sense to me. Now, the thing is, though, like why this is all false is like you kind of touched on it a little bit here when you were just saying that like once you get to those high intensities, you're burning more carbohydrates, and we want to burn more
gas,
fat
to the fire.
But you got to think of the big picture here. Mm-hmm. So when you exercise and burn a bunch of fat at these low intensities, fat burning zones, sure, you're breaking down more fatty acids. But what you have not done is you have not changed the amount of glucose circulating around in your bloodstream or the amount of glucose that is in your cells. So once you're burning those fatty acids after exercise, you're kind of just done burning calories. Sure, your body's going to be ramped up a little bit and like you'll still be pretty metabolically active afterwards. But what happens when you have a lot of carbohydrates, if you're taking in excess calories and you've got all these carbs and they're converted into glucose, your body it needs to maintain a certain level of glucose. If glucose goes too high, you've got so many issues that can happen with all these organs. And if it goes too low, then you've got a separate set of problems. So your body has this constant need to maintain glucose levels. Now, when glucose gets really high, what'll happen is the liver will go through what's called de novo lipogenesis, where it'll take those glucose molecules and it'll convert them into fatty acids. So now you've got more fatty acids because of that glucose. And those fatty acids converted into triglycerides that are stored in adipose tissue or fat cells. And so if you're not touching carbohydrates and you're burning fat, you're going to be building a lot more fat.
Yeah, because you're not burning that stuff.
Because you're not burning these carbohydrates. And so when you exercise at the higher intensities, what you do is you deplete those intracellular stores of glucose or that glycogen inside of the muscle. Then your muscle cell becomes really sensitive to insulin. So type 2 diabetes, we've got a bunch of podcasts where we talk about it. I'm trying to think of like a specific one. I feel like I touch on it quite a bit to refer people to, but a lot of those diet episodes, actually the high fat versus low fat debate, we talk a ton about this. But essentially when you get type 2 diabetes and it spirals out of control, you get a bunch of fat buildup in the liver, you get metabolic fatty liver disease and all these other disorders. The underlying reason this is happening is because of excess energy, excess glucose, and your cells become less responsive to insulin. Insulin is that chaperone that's grabbing the little glucose kids from the streets and bringing them home to the muscle cell. Now, when you go through high intensity exercise, you've depleted that glucose. The muscle's like, whoa, I need some of that freaking glucose. I'm going to see if insulin's around to bring me some. And so you become really sensitive to it and you pull in that glucose to the cell, store it as glycogen. Now you do that instead of storing it as fat, right?
Yeah.
So you're actually going to be decreasing fat by doing this higher intensity exercise because you're preventing that conversion of those glucose molecules to fatty acids, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. You still going?
I'll go forever. I'm going to still go.
Well, we also had a thing is if you train too high of intensities all the time, once you deplete all those carbs that you have, that now energy, that fuel the fire, your body actually has to go through muscle instead of, because it takes a lot longer for the fat to go through the Krebs cycle and everything to process that. Is there truth to that too? Because like if you train too high intensity, you're actually doing yourself a disservice kind of by stealing energy from your muscles. Is that truth to that one? Because that was another pitch. It's like we don't want to train too high here because you deplete all that, then you're cutting down your muscle. We don't want to do that. You're not really getting that fat burning. So we'd always do like high intensity with like a low intensity, kind of like cardio after that for a minute, back to high intensity.
But you're worried about burning fat. Yeah, this is another claim that I think makes sense when you think about it, but isn't really what happens. Now, your body never wants to use amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. Yeah. It doesn't want to use amino acids for energy.
Yeah.
And it's not going to unless you have such low energy to begin with, and it's going to have to resort to that. So people that don't have enough protein intake, don't have enough energy intake overall, and are working out way too much, they're going to start to break down amino acids, and muscle is like the biggest storage area for protein in the body. So yeah, it's going to come from the muscle. But that doesn't happen when you're exercising unless, you're just malnourished at that point.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen when, the average individual is out doing high intensity exercise. And the reason is once you deplete the glucose stores, like if you're going all out to the point where you've depleted those the glycogen stores and glucose, like you're going to be falling over. Like it doesn't just like, you're going to fatigue at that point because it's going to be really intense exercise and you're not going to be able to sustain it to the point where you're even going to use amino acids. Another cool thing is lactate. Cells have this lactate shuttling capacity. So there's this guy named George Brooks that discovered these transporters on the ends of certain cells, muscle cells being one of them, that can actually take in lactate and you reverse that process and utilize it for energy. So lactate can go back to pyruvate, go into the Krebs cycle, or lactate can even go into the mitochondria itself. It doesn't even have to get converted into mitochondria. We didn't know this, decades ago. So you probably hear like, oh, lactic acid, like it's so bad.
Oh yeah.
But no, like lactate provides fuel to other cells. And especially like type 1 muscle fibers are really good at bringing up lactate and utilizing it. So when your muscles are spitting out lactate, it's actually a good thing. They're like, other cells might need this. Like we're not using it. Let's spit it out. And then these cells that are really good at taking up lactate, like type 1 muscle fibers, they're going to do that and utilize it. So your body's got other forms of energy and it's not going to need to rely on protein here.
Okay. I was like, that was kind of one of our pitching points, why we didn't train too high intensity.
Yeah.
The stress and potentially going to your muscles for fuel.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's a bunch of baloney. Okay.
Yeah.
The muscle one.
Plus, like amino acids take a long time to go through the Krebs cycle too.
Yeah.
And it requires energy to convert amino acids into glucose, like gluconeogenesis, like you use energy to do that.
Yeah.
Why the hell would your body want to use energy to then like if you're requiring energy at that time, it's not going to want to utilize energy to do something. So yeah, it doesn't happen. And like looking into the research, so we'll link to these studies, but I just pulled a bunch, like, and there's so many papers comparing different intensities, so like high versus moderate, and it's essentially this fat burning myth that's totally debunked within the literature. So I pulled a few papers starting from 2018, some randomized controlled trials. One in particular was with like diabetic individuals, diabetic adults, that when they were randomized to a 10-week protocol of either 3 10-minute higher intensity bouts of exercise versus just moderate intensity exercise. And when we're referring to moderate or fat burning zone, there's another study that I'll link to that shows that the maximum amount of fat utilization occurs right at like 63% of VO2 max. So a lot of like moderate or zone 2, you'll see like right at like 60 to 75 range or 60 to 70% VO2 max. And so these studies, they utilize that intensity and then a high intensity, which is usually like 85% VO2 max or above. Yeah. And so when you look at the data, so this is over the course of 10 weeks, they found that the individuals doing higher intensity exercise had an increase in their resting energy expenditure, so that basal metabolic rate. They had an increase in insulin sensitivity and an increase in the amount of muscle mitochondria. So we've talked about like, and you hear people talk about zone 2, and zone 2 is great because you're stressing the mitochondria at max capacity. But that's not to say that high intensity exercise isn't great for the mitochondria, because like this particular paper showed high intensity actually stimulated mitochondria, what we call biogenesis, so making more mitochondria in the cell, more than moderate intensity exercise. And that's a trend within the literature. You see that high intensity exercise burns more calories overall than moderate intensity exercise. There's a systematic review from 2022 that we'll link to, and it used high intensity interval training or sprint interval training compared to moderate intensity, and found that the high intensity interval training burned more energy overall. And it also improved in fatty acid utilization compared to carbohydrate or I shouldn't say that. It improved the muscle cells and the other cells in the body's ability to utilize fatty acids and carbohydrates. And so we see that high intensity exercise actually has more of a benefit. Now, these, what we call effect sizes, where you look at the statistics here, especially in that meta-analysis from 2022, the effect here when you compare high intensity versus moderate is not huge. You know, it's not like high intensity is way better. You know, there's a minor effect. It was significant, but it's not to say that like you should only be doing high intensity exercise. Moderate intensity exercise is great. But what I'm stressing here is that it is in no way better than high intensity exercise, and it does not burn more fat. Like it absolutely does not. And we got to touch on EPOC to explain that. Do you have any more questions before I go on more?
Go into EPOC. Yep.
So when you think about like, why the hell does this happen? Like why does high intensity exercise result in more calories burned overall? And I should mention, these studies are equating work. So the same amount of total work output between high intensity versus low intensity. So the lower intensity groups you'll see are doing a longer duration versus high intensity to try to equate those things of like how much like active work are you doing. And so when you do high intensity exercise, like you can't sustain that workout for nearly as long, right? Versus if you go for, like a 10-mile run at a very slow pace versus sprints for 5 minutes. Like people think like, oh, if I go to the gym, I just got to like hop on the treadmill and just be there for as long as I possibly can. Because if I do, 10 1-minute sprints with 1 minute recovery, I'm there for 20 minutes and I got to be there for an hour or something. You know, like you think of like more time equaling more calories, but that's not the case. And a lot of it comes down to this EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Now, I talked about the metabolic cart here. And when you look in, when you have someone on a metabolic cart, which I know you've done, and you watch people go through like a VO2 max test, well, they got to come for a cool down, and where they're coming down from this high intensity, and you let them recover, but you still have this mask on. So you watch the oxygen that they're taking in after they've stopped exercising and are just walking. Well, that exercise or that oxygen consumption remains really high. You're still breathing so heavy, and that's pretty prolonged. Like you're taking in so much oxygen and you're still exhaling a lot of CO2. And the reason is your body's utilizing a ton of energy to try to replenish and restore all the fuel you've used. And as you go through that recovery process, you're ramping up your metabolic rate. You're ramping up the amount of calories you're burning after exercise. Now, high intensity exercise has this huge increase in EPOC. So you're taking in more oxygen, you're burning more calories after exercise is done. So overall, you end up burning more calories. And this all comes back to a calorie thing. Because if you're doing moderate intensity exercise and you're burning less calories, well, where are all those excess calories going, right? They're going to get stored as fat. Versus high intensity exercise, you're burning more. And so you're breaking down carbohydrates. You're going to end up utilizing more fat in the long run versus because you're burning more calories.
Yeah, you're burning more calories.
Intensity. So
that makes a ton of sense.
And it's very clear in the research. Again, I'll link to these studies that were within the last 5 years. There's a bunch of papers that I pulled up immediately. And reading through them, it's like, again, these effect sizes aren't huge, but it's very clear that there is no, you're not getting a fat burning benefit from being at moderate intensity exercise.
Yeah. Wow. Dude, that just that just killed it. Like, I should have been doing zone 3, 4, and 5 training this whole time. Because, I mean, they'd be still burning more fat later on during the day. But if you optimize that calorie burn each workout, I could have found way better results with my clients.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is what do they want to do? Instead
I know,
of
you don't want to just like, hey, push the sled for an hour, let's go.
Yeah,
and then they're going to be like, I'm never come back.
Yeah, if someone is like doing high intensity and you're worried like, oh, they're never going to come back and see me, like you said, like that's why this fat burning zone is such a selling point. But people just sell it in the wrong way. Like if you want to do moderate intensity exercise, do it, because in the long run, you're going to get more benefit if you can remain consistent. If you don't like high intensity exercise, then, if it's keeping you from going into the gym, then don't do it.
Yeah. So it's better to just go in the gym if you like the low intensity, but you're going to see way better results if you sprinkle in some high intensity stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say way better, but yeah, you're going to get better results doing higher intensity. But it's not going to be, because like when you think of total daily energy expenditure or the amount of calories you're burning, now resting energy expenditure makes up like 60 to 70% of the amount of calories you're burning. Physical activity or exercise calories is only like 10 to 15%. And then you have what's called non-exercise thermogenesis or non-exercise adaptive thermogenesis, NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT. And that is like fidgeting, moving around, just being restless.
Yeah.
That can like make up quite a bit of energy expenditure for certain people. And then you have the thermic effect of food where, if you haven't listened to the protein episode, go listen to that one, because we talk about like how your body burns energy when you're taking in fuel, and protein actually burns more calories, like the thermic effect of food, and increases metabolic rate. So all those things are contributing, but I bring that up just to remind you that like exercise really doesn't burn a whole lot of calories.
Yeah, 10 to 15%.
So like if your goal is fat loss, like you need to be focusing on just being in a calorie deficit.
Yep.
And so just don't eat a ton and move as much as you can. Like 10 to 15% of metabolic rate, like that's still a lot, but it's like if fat burning is your goal, like you really need to address the calories in, calories out thing.
Mm-hmm. That's why we said 80% nutrition, 20% exercise. But I know that's not what you...
If we're talking about weight loss, you could make that argument. But as far as like
you're kinda
benefits to your health, exercise is 10 times better than nutrition. For those of you that haven't heard the exercise versus nutrition debate, I will convince you why exercise is more important overall for your health than nutrition, for sure.
But it's really nice to get that nutrition dialed in. But they're both beneficial. We're not saying
absolutely.
one. Yeah. So a lot of the gyms nowadays do heart rate training, like Lifetime does it, and Orange Theory. Do you know if there's any differences between how they both do it? Because like Lifetime does zone 1 through 5, 80% in the zone 1, zone 2, and then 20% in 3, 4, and 5. Do you know the difference? Do you know how Orange Theory does their heart rate training? And is it optimal? Is it better?
Yeah, from what I know, like the orange zone is those higher zones. I don't know if it's like zone 4 or what, but you're trying to target the higher zones versus like what you're saying with Lifetime is like you only want, what'd you say, 20%?
20% in 3, 4,
80%
5.
at the lower ones. Yeah.
Unless it's changed since I was last there. But yeah.
So I would not listen to like Lifetime's model. And a lot of gyms may have that same model. Again, it's for sales purposes. Those gyms, like that stuff isn't true. And don't listen to that claim of like you don't want to be exercising in high intensity, especially if you're stressed and all this stuff. Like, no, actually, like if you're doing high intensity exercise, like if you're stressed out and you go sprint, just like think about how much better you feel at that point when you're done with it. Now, I'm not talking about while you're doing it.
Yeah, it's terrible. I get it.
You think of like the like catecholamine release and this adrenaline and this like runner's high that we talk about and this feeling after doing high intensity exercise. Like if you're stressed out, you should be doing it. So don't listen to that bullshit of like, no, if you're stressed out and you don't want cortisol increasing and like it's just gonna make you more stressed. Like, no, it's gonna be the exact opposite. The exact opposite. And so your question about like Lifetime versus Orange Theory, I don't know a ton about like gym models. I just see like at the gyms I go to these heart rate zones that are just based off heart rate max, which again, like I get why they're up there. You want to give people some information, but if you don't know your resting heart rate, they're just not very accurate. And don't listen to people who preach the fat burning zone. And Orange Theory seems to like stress high intensity exercise. I don't know enough about it to like speak on the model.
Okay.
But I think that orange zone is higher intensity.
Higher intensity? Okay. And let's dive into a little bit of Reed's Reddit finds here. I only got 2 today, which we kind of... I mean, again, we pretty much hit these questions. They're all the same as what we were already talking about.
Yeah, but we should. I think you're right. Maybe we should do the Reed's Reddits at the beginning because otherwise then I'm going to answer everything.
We just debunked them right now.
Gosh.
So I looked up fat burning zones on Reddit, and one of the first questions I saw was, is zone 2 or HIIT better for fat loss?
HIIT
training?
It's clear in the research. Yeah. I mean, it's quicker. You don't need as much time. You end up burning more calories overall. And in those papers, you see a more significant reduction in body fat percentage and more calories burned overall. Plus the like interesting area of research is like the effect that it has on insulin resistance. Why do you have like a disgusted face?
I had a little itch in my stomach.
Insulin? Is he going to go on a freaking tangent again?
I have to do a HIIT training now? Gosh, no. Okay, so the answer is HIIT training on that one.
Yep.
That was easy. I know we already touched upon it earlier, but all right, here we go. Best target heart rate zone for weight loss / fat loss.
I hate this topic so
That was
much.
Basically every question. Those 2 were just only 2.
Well, it's good. That's, I mean,
what
the
people
reality
want.
is like this discussion sucks because it's like most people that are into this topic are the people that like go and just do cardio thinking that that's going to cause them to lose a bunch of weight. Like it's the people that are like, oh, I'm going to go for my run. I don't have time to lift weights and whatever. Like, really, to answer that question is like, get some freaking muscle. Like, we're talking about how metabolically active your body is. Well, when you have more muscle uses a shit ton of energy all the time. More muscle equals more calories lost, more fat loss, more weight loss. Like, if you want to know the max or the perfect target heart rate, just figure out what that is when you're lifting weights and do that. Like, and I say that just to say, like, you should be weightlifting and not focusing on your cardio as much. Now, if you're trying to really, really dial it in, then what you want to do is, when you're doing cardio, calculate your resting heart rate and your maximum heart rate. You can calculate your true max by, doing what's called a graded exercise test, where you slowly increase the speed, whatever you're on, stairs, bike, or treadmill, until you fatigue, and then check that heart rate once you like hit the maximum capacity, where you like feel like you can't exercise anymore, like you've fatigued. That's your true max heart rate. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can do 220 minus your age. It's a somewhat accurate measurement. It's way off for me. But some people, it's close enough. And so once you know max heart rate and resting heart rate, calculate the difference of that. That's your heart rate reserve. And then what you want to do is you want to find, right around like 85% of that, and add that to your resting heart rate. So you calculate 85% of that heart rate reserve, add it to your resting heart rate. That's your target heart rate for that like high intensity, like if you want to do interval training and such, which, based on the research, and go to that meta-analysis from 2022 and take a peek at that. Like most of these papers are right around 85%. And that shows the greatest outcomes. But again, if that's really your goal, consistency, and lift weights. Get some muscle.
That was the only two Reddit finds I had. But do you think heart rate monitors are important for working out? Do you need them? If you don't have one, do you think someone should get a heart rate monitor? Is that something you should put into your workout plan? If your goal is fat loss.
No. If your goal is fat loss, no. I mean, like, you can go off of how you feel. So RPE, rating of perceived exertion, like if you're going like on a 1 to 10 scale and you're trying to push yourself to, right around an 8, like you're going to be at a pretty high intensity.
Yeah.
There.
As long as you can figure out what that RPE, like, all right, I'm probably at an 8 right now. Then you kind of know. Okay.
What I would tell someone is hop on a treadmill, bike, whatever you're doing, find an intensity that you couldn't sustain for longer than 15 minutes. And if that's the case, actually shift it to 10, because people tend to underestimate their capacity. So think of something that you couldn't sustain for more than 10 minutes. And that intensity should be above this aerobic capacity, should be above zone 2. And if you're there, you're doing higher intensity exercise, and you can do intervals where then you go to an intensity that you feel like you could sustain for like a half hour, your whole workout.
Yeah.
And that can be like a recovery period. And you can kind of bounce back and forth. You don't really have to use your heart rate. Now, what's cool about heart rate though is you can kind of watch your body adapt, and you can see like over time, if you hopped on the treadmill at the same speed, if we did a baseline test where I had you get on and I had you shoot for 85% of heart rate reserve, and then I had you do like a 5-week training program. And after 5 weeks, you hopped on again, and we used that same estimate, 85%. Well, one, your resting heart rate would be lower. And once you achieve that speed of the treadmill or watts on the bike that we were at before, you'd find that your heart rate would be a lot lower, because it's easier for your body. Your body's adapted. And that's one of the first things you'll notice. So I think it's cool to see that happen and to kind of provide you with a little feedback of like, oh, this shit is working. My heart is becoming way stronger. It can pump more with each beat. So my resting heart rate is a lot lower. I've become so efficient at utilizing fuel and getting rid of waste and distributing my blood throughout the body that like I don't have to ramp up my heart. Like this is easy for me to do. and heart rate is like the best feedback tool there.
Yeah.
Now heart rate watches nowadays are pretty darn
They weren't very good like 7 years ago, but now they're like pretty spot on.
they're pretty accurate. Well, like when I was doing a lot of these max tests, VO2 max tests for like research and in exercise physiology labs, and like most of the time people are wearing their watches, and we also have a polar heart rate monitor that's strapped to their chest that are very accurate.
Yeah,
And you
the closer
compare
to the
them,
heart, the
they're
more
pretty
accurate.
spot
That's
on,
kind
though.
of, yeah.
Like nowadays they are spot on. So if you've got a wrist worn strap, as long as it's like flush to your skin but not cutting off circulation, like those things tend to be pretty accurate.
Pretty accurate.
So like you don't have to use it, but it is a cool feedback tool.
Yeah. I noticed that a lot. Is like I'd reassess people, or like we couldn't get to that zone 3 like we used to, and then it would just bump people's exercises up, and it was cool for them to see like, hey, my VO2 max went up, my heart rate zones have changed, my speeds have changed on the treadmill. So it was really cool feedback. So that was a really awesome thing for reassessing those RMAs. No,
Right.
AMAs, the active metabolic assessment.
Yeah. And when we do an episode about like endurance training for like marathon athletes, triathletes, and people that are really dialed in
Yeah.
to their endurance training, like then it's a whole different story of like how you can utilize heart rate and lactate, and like you can get to a T like where your body's at in fuel utilization, and you can dial in your training to change those things. It gets like really cool when you look into like what you can do with an endurance athlete,
Yeah.
and how precise you can get to somebody's individual physiology and how they will perform. Yeah, and we'll do that on a different episode.
Well, that's it for Reed's Reddit finds. But a question that I brought up is doing too much HIIT training bad for you? Or is there a certain age where you should not do as much? So like, say you hit 60 or 70, you shouldn't be doing too much high intensity interval training. Is there anything like that? Any research that shows any of that?
No, I mean, when we did, what was that episode even about?
VO2 max?
Oh, no, strength training.
Strength training?
Yeah, where we talked about like the study that took women who were postmenopausal and had osteopenia, so low bone mineral density, and like are very like fragile group of individuals, plus the additional research of like high percent 1 rep max, like high intensity strength training in individuals that are like 85 years old.
Yeah.
Like you look at the results of those studies showing that like high intensity has greater improvement in a lot of factors, like increasing bone mineral density and like preventing injury down the road versus moderate intensity. But the thing is, if you don't have a base to your training, and that's something we haven't really talked about in this episode, like you shouldn't just hop right into high intensity interval training. Like
You're going to pull a hammy.
yeah, you need to, yeah, that's another thing. Like you got to warm up.
Yeah.
But you need to know how to correctly do these movements and fire the correct muscles and make sure that you're not getting injured. And that's the same with any type of training. But I would say HIIT training, no, you can't do too much unless you're like overtraining and like, you know, not giving yourself time to recover. There used to be this idea of, again, like if you're doing high intensity, you have this increase in these inflammatory markers and like that's not good for you. But you look into the data and you see that people do high intensity interval training are, you know, have improved immune function, improved inflammatory responses. So no, like that's not true. So yeah, anyone can do it. It's just you need to do it safely, just like anything else. Did that answer your question?
That was actually spot on. Yeah. All right. So we actually had a listener question. Actually, before we get to the listener question, let's go over Dr. Luke's ideal plan for losing fat loss. Instead of this whole like zone training thing, what's the ideal? Someone's going to start working out. They want to burn as much fat as possible, get tone. What's your ideal plan? What do we do? Boom.
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 Yeah. So I would say if you're just picking up exercise and your goal is to improve body composition or reduce fat, what you want to do is try to figure out what is bringing you back to the gym after you get through the motivation stage. So everyone has the health kick that comes with the motivation stage, where it's usually about a week, where you're very consistent. And
usually after January 1st.
yeah, exactly. And you're usually very consistent for a period of time, and you change your whole food pantry, and you're just like, you've got it, you're ready,
Dialed in.
But then you fall off, and you try to go like once every couple days, and then it turns into once a week, once every other week, and so on. Now, what you want to do when you're not in that health kick phase is you want to figure out like what part of the exercise did you enjoy, and you want to start with that, whether that be weight training, whether that be body weight exercises, or yoga, or biking, or running, or swimming, whatever it is that you're like, oh, I'm kind of excited to go do this one thing. That's what you need to start with. From there, you'll get into a habit of going to the gym. That will take some discipline, and that's the biggest thing, is you need discipline to get yourself consistent. Once you've got that habit developed, then you can start working on your specific type of training. And the biggest thing for fat loss or improving body composition is going to be prioritizing strength training, prioritizing any sort of resistance training where you're working your muscles, and then you can add the cardio in however you want to do it. You can do moderate intensity, you can do high intensity. We just talked about how high intensity is going to be more beneficial, and you can also do it a lot faster. And so if you don't have a lot of time, maybe high intensity exercise is a good idea for you. And how that can look is do an activity that you can only do for 10 minutes and just do it for 10 minutes. Like that's what I do. I hop on the stairs a lot of the time, and I just do 10 minutes at a high enough intensity so that when I'm done with the 10 minutes, I'm usually right about VO2 max, and I've done my high intensity exercise, and then I go into my lifting where I can focus most of my time. Now, if I spent more time doing cardio, then it would take away from the amount of time I could do when I'm lifting, especially like when I'm working at the hospital and like these long days, and like I don't have the time to do these long workouts.
What intensity are you working out, like doing your exercises after that VO2 max has been achieved for 10 minutes on the Stairmaster?
What am I doing?
Yeah, like
for
are you
strength
doing
training?
Yeah, are you doing are you doing supersets? Are you doing
Right now? I'm doing a like lower intensity, higher rep phase that I just started a couple weeks ago, where I'm actually doing full body resistance training 4 times a week, sometimes 5 times a week, and I'm not going till fatigue. And so I'm doing more of like a focused on body composition as opposed to muscle building. So I just had done the muscle building phase where it was like go to fatigue, hypertrophy. So if you haven't listened to that episode, hit that episode, where it doesn't matter what intensity you're at, you just got to go to fatigue. And then I have since shifted, but it'll change. And that's important too, is like, for me, I found if I do one type of training, after a few months, I'm sick of it. I got to switch it up.
Yeah.
I got to see some different results. I got to spend my time a little bit different. I get too into a routine that it I want to get the excitement of changing it up. So I change.
Yeah, I do the same thing.
Like 3 to 4 months, I kind of change how I'm training, which is awesome because then I provide a different stress that my body has to adapt to. But before I go too much on that tangent, like back to your question. Now, the optimum way to burn fat, high intensity is going to be better than low intensity. For you, high intensity exercise is get yourself to an intensity that you couldn't sustain for longer than 10 minutes. That's a great way to do it. You're getting that work in. You're going to feel that you're fatiguing, and then focus on strength training. And when you're doing strength training, you want to focus on major muscle groups, chest, back, core, lower body, and make sure you're hitting those muscle groups. Tune in to the strength and hypertrophy episodes where we really break down how to do that. And consistency is key. Try to shoot for 3 to 5 days per week in the gym, and don't allow yourself to go a full week without training each muscle group at least one time. Does that?
Yeah. And so did you finish the whole like optimal Dr. Luke plan? Is that the end of it? Anything else you want to add to it?
Make sure you get your protein in.
And get your protein in.
And then listen to all the Kickback Science episodes.
Yeah, every single one.
I mean, really, like, the underlying thing of this episode is this fat burning zone and all these, like, you know, this is going to burn fat. Even with supplements, like, oh, this is a fat burning supplement. Like, this intensity or this workout's going to burn most fat. Here's the 5 best exercises for fat loss. Like, those are the things, like, that's a red flag.
Yeah.
Don't listen to that. It doesn't work that way. Fat loss comes from being in a caloric deficit, and it has nothing to do with, you know, this fat burning intensity or the fat burning zone. So fat burning zone is a lie. If you like doing it, do it, but it's not the optimum way to burn fat. That's not how it works.
So we do have a listener question from Eric. It was on our hypertrophy episode. They're wondering, they said, you guys mentioned work out twice a week, a muscle group for 15 sets to build size. Do all 15 sets have to be focused on that muscle group? For example, shoulders are activated for almost any chest and back exercise, especially like an incline bench press. Do those sets count for shoulders only, or do I have to do more shoulder specific movements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're what he's kind of talking about is these like primary and secondary muscles in the movement. So like when you're doing a chest press, like your chest is the primary muscle group involved, but you've got secondary muscles that are assisting in that movement, like your shoulders and triceps there. If you're going for hypertrophy specific, which is what he's asking about, is like hypertrophy. Okay. So Eric, if you're training for hypertrophy, you do need to hit the primary muscles that, you know, it's anywhere from 12 to 20 was the research. 15, again, is a great number. And so a lot of people, when they're training hypertrophy specific, you'll see them do like a full on shoulder day, and it sucks.
It's not my favorite.
Yeah. I mean, like, you do need to hit those muscles if that is your goal. But if just building muscle in general, like not worried about like building them as big as possible, but if you're working on like strength, you don't have to do that. You know, you can do chest press knowing that you're incorporating shoulders and triceps, and then you can do a seated row knowing that you're incorporating biceps. But if hypertrophy is your goal, you do need to isolate those primary muscle or those muscles doing primary movements to isolate those specific muscles. That's how you're going to get the greatest impact, because when you're doing a chest press and you get to that last rep in fatigue, like we're talking about the hypertrophy, you got to hit fatigue. Well, your shoulders are not the ones that have fatigued on that movement. You got to do a movement that you fatigue your shoulders specifically. And so, you know, that doesn't apply to these like minor stabilizing muscles and all that. Obviously, you're not going to take the time to, you know, really strengthen your extensor digitoris. but
your rhomboids.
Well, rhomboids. Yeah, you're not like... You're kind of isolating your rhomboids when you're doing rows and such, but you've got multiple muscles there. But yeah, shoulders are a big one. Like shoulders, triceps, biceps, chest, abs, back, and quads, hamstrings, calves. And like even within your back, like people are isolating traps usually on shoulder days and lats and rhomboids. Like you are focusing on those specific muscles with hypertrophy. That was a long way to answer the question of like, yes.
Let's just beat around the bush real quick with some
Eric,
science.
The answer is yes. You should be training your shoulders too, if that's your primary goal.
That was awesome. Just want to make it clear that I wasn't bashing my old gym. Still love you guys. Just the fat burning zone.
Were we not supposed to say their name?
I don't know, but there was a lot of good that came out of it. It's just the fat burning zones aren't as optimal as hitting high intensity, as what Dr. Luke was kind of saying. So just please don't be mad at me. But if you guys have any questions like Eric did, either feel free to reach out on social media like Kickback Science, or our email kickbackscience@gmail.com. Or visit our page. We also have some protein, creatine, and melatonin. If you're interested in those supplements, you can buy those and help support our podcast.
Yeah. And, you know, submitting questions, we have a submission link on the website. And also each episode now, there's a link when you click on the episode that says, send us a text. that text, like you can just text from your phone. It'll shoot straight to our email, like on the podcast while you're listening to it. So you don't even have to waste time to go to the website and all that. But yeah, I mean, if you do go to the website and are purchasing protein or whatever supplements, like we'll be adding supplements that you can purchase through our website. Again, please do that. Make sure you like and subscribe, leave a comment, smash that like and subscribe button.
Smash.
And then follow us at Kickback Science on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. We have a Facebook page as well, and a YouTube channel. So give us a follow to stay up to date on the information we're releasing. And then you can also sign up for our newsletter on the website as well. So thanks for tuning in.
We miss you, Joe.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.